at Sidney's Apology, and Sidney told us the Latin name of a poet is Artis, which means a prophet, and the Greek name of poet is from the Greek word poei, which means to make. Therefore, a poet is a maker. And then he says that all other subjects, they revolve around their particular subject matter. So they are not free. Sidney calls it the circle of a question. As I told you that he is using a scholastic term, the term questio, which means a particular theme. The grammarian speaketh only of the rules of speech, the rhetorician and logician. So we looked at this, and I mentioned the trivium, grammar, rhetoric and logic, as well as the quadrivium that Sidney earlier discusses, the sciences of number, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry and music. Then he says that poetry is the only subject which transcends nature. All other subjects are tied to nature. Particularly all the science subjects, moral philosophy, natural philosophy, they are tied to their particular subject matter in nature. Only the poet is daring to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, that grow in effect another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite anew, forms such never were in nature, as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like. So as it goes hand in hand with nature, not enclosed within the narrow warrant of the gifts, but freely ranging only within the zodiac of his own wit. Can you switch off your microphone? Sidney says that the poet disdains to be tied to any such subjection, any subject, and he grows another nature. So he suggests that only poets can create a different nature or a new nature, and he is not limited to the nature in which he finds himself, or the world in which he finds himself. And he gives this argument a memorable expression by saying that the nature's world is brazen, that is made of bronze, but the poet's world is golden, which means that the world that the poet creates is much better. So he says that he bringeth forth quite anew, that is, he brings forth, he creates a new nature, and he creates such things which are not in nature, like cyclops, demigods, chimeras, furies. So all the supernatural or fantastic or mythical beings that poets have imagined in their poetry, but they are not to be found in nature. So he ranges freely within the zodiac of his own wit. That is, his only limitation is his own imagination. Here wit stands for imagination. The word wit was versatile and sometimes stood for intellect, at other times imagination, and so on. So the poet is limited only by his imagination. Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done. So the poet's world has a rich tapestry. It is extremely rich in design, in pattern, in ornamentation. Nature never created such a beautiful world. Neither with pleasant rivers, fruitful trees, sweet-smelling flowers, not whatsoever else may make the too much loved earth more lovely. So, whatever the poets imagine, the flowers, the rivers, the trees and all that, the poet surpasses nature in making all these beautiful things. Her world is brazen, that is, nature's world is brazen. The poets only deliver a golden. So this is a very pithy remark and memorable saying that poets deliver a golden word. Now this idea that the poets create another world as opposed to our everyday mundane world, this was not Sidney's invention, but he borrowed it from another Renaissance writer, namely Fracastoro, an Italian writer, who wrote a book called Undergraduates. Sidney was well known well read in European literature. In this treatise, he borrows from many European writers, but very appropriately, so never out of context. So Sidney borrows this idea that the poet's nature is a different or new world from Fracastoro and his book Undergraduates. But let those things alone and go to man, for whom as the other things are. So it seemeth in him uttermost cunning is employed. So man is cunning here means intelligent, imaginative. So he says that in man we can see his intelligence and know whether she have brought forth so true a lover as Theagenes, so constant a friend as Pylades, so valiant a man as Orlando, so right a prince as Xenophon Silas, so excellent a man every way as Virgilius Aeneas. So these are all characters from literature. And Sidney says that in nature, that is in real world, you will never find such characters. Because the characters in literature, they are much more perfect than anybody in the world. And here he alludes to a number of characters. For example, Theagenes is a character, a lover, in a Greek novel of the 3rd century AD called Ethiopica by Heliodorus. So I am writing in the chat box. The name of the author is Heliodorus. His dates are 220 to 370 AD. And the name of his novel is Ethiopica. And the story Sidney is referring to, or the book, the story is of Theagenes and Chariclia, two lovers, Theagenes and Chariclia. Their story is told by Heliodorus. So Theagenes is a great lover, the example of which cannot be found in the world. Constant friend Pylades, that is a reference to friend of Orestes in Greek mythology. You know the Orestian trilogy by Sophocles. Pylades was a friend of Orestes in Greek mythology. So valiant a man as Orlando. Now we all know that Orlando is the medieval knight of King Arthur's Round Table, Roland. and these knights they can be found in medieval romances. Their stories can be found, and on the basis of the story of Roland, written in Chanson de Roland in French. The name of the medieval romance is Chanson de Roland, written in Old French in the 11th century. And on the basis of this, you all know that the Italian poet Ariosto wrote the famous Renaissance epic. What is the name of the epic? Orlando Furioso. So Ariosto and Tasso, these were two famous Italian writers of epic, and Sidney, of course, read them. But the character Orlando is very old in literature, so I told you that in the 11th century, the Chanson de Roland celebrates Orlando as a hero. So Sidney says that such a great man, valiant man, that is a great soldier, a great knight, in literature, whether he is referring to the medieval Chanson de Roland or to Ariosto, which is more likely, that is not clear. But such a man that we can find in literature cannot be found in the real world. So write it means as Xenophon's Cyrus. Xenophon, a famous Greek author, you may know that Xenophon, Greek author who wrote a book called Cyropedia, which is about the Persian Emperor Cyrus. So Xenophon represented Cyrus as a great prince in his book. What I was trying to remember was that Xenophon also wrote about Socrates, and we have a parallel literature on Socrates by Plato. So both Xenophon and Plato wrote on Socrates. So excellent a man everywhere, Virgil's Aeneas. So Aeneas is Virgil's hero in the Aeneid and an excellent man. So Sidney wonders that such characters that we find in literature, they cannot be found in real life. Therefore, literature exceeds or goes beyond the real world. So I can see that on the screen now there are only 3 viewers and most have left. So have you all joined the Google Meet? Why did you leave the screen? Anybody? Anyway, there are only 22 or 21 of you. I just experimented with the screen. I wanted to know whether it is working or not. Neither let this be jestingly conceived, because the works of the one be essential, the other in imitation or fiction. For any understanding knoweth the skill of the artificer standeth in that idea or foreconceit of the work, and not in the work itself. What is Sidney saying here? That work of one is essential, that is, in work of nature is essential. Work of the poets is imitation or fiction. And anybody knows that the artificer, that is, the artist, gets his image from idea or foreconceit, and there one can see the skill of the artist, how far he can follow the idea or the foreconceit of the work. Now here Sidney is following the Platonic notion that word originally remains in idea. So idea or form, that is the true thing. Basically it is the idea in God's mind which is reflected in nature, and then the artist imitates that nature, so the artist is twice removed from the truth. And then the poet has that idea is manifest by delivering them forth in such excellency as he has imagined them. So in this respect, a poet is like God. God created the world from his idea, and the poet also created the world, his imaginary world, from his idea. Which delivering forth also is not only imaginative, as we are wont to say by them that wind passes in the air, but so far substantially it worketh, not only to make a Cyrus, which had been but a particular excellency, as nature might have done, but to bestow a Cyrus upon the world, to make many Cyruses, if they will learn aright why and how that Maker made him. So here Sidney suggests that what the poet creates, that should not be taken as mere imagination or fiction, but it has a huge influence upon this world. How? Because in literature, say Xenophon created the character Cyrus, a great prince, and that would have a great influence upon men, because men would try to imitate him. And actually that happened because Alexander the Great, the Greek emperor, he tried to imitate Cyrus. He read Cyropedia and tried to imitate Cyrus. So Sidney's point is that what the poet creates is not in vain. On the other hand, it has a huge influence on people, because people try to emulate the ideas of the characters created by a poet. Then he goes on to say that the poet's creativeness is the highest human faculty. Neither let it be deemed too saucy a comparison to balance the highest point of man's wit with the efficacy of nature, but rather give right honor to the heavenly maker of that maker, who having made man in his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature. So poet Sidney says that God made man in his own image, here quoting or alluding to the Bible, and made man in such a manner that man will be lord over the second nature, that is, the nature that you create, because man is also a maker, which in nothing he shows so much as in poetry, when in the force of a divine breath, we bring things forth far surpassing our doings. So man's creation of poetry is just like God's creation of the world. As God blows his breath into the world and the world comes alive. Similarly, poet breathes into his work, makes it come alive, and therefore is no small argument to the incredulous of that first accursed fall of Adam, since our elected wit maketh us know what perfection is, and yet our infected will keepeth us from reaching unto it. So when Sidney is saying this, that a poet is like a divine maker, like God, he creates a new world. He is expecting opposition from the clergymen or the Orthodox Christians, because he is investing man with too much creativity, too much power. So he says that man, in spite of Adam's fall, man has the wit to know what is perfection. That is, man can appreciate God's creation by his wit, by his brain. So the Calvinistic theory that man is a depraved being after his fall, and he has lost his glory, he has lost his wit, divine wit. Sidney opposes that by saying that maybe man's will is infected. He has an infected will, and that is why he cannot reach unto the perfection. But he has an erected wit. So man is erected because he stands on his 2 feet, unlike animals, and therefore he has a developed brain. And Sidney is opposing here the force of Calvinism, which suggested that man is a fallen creature, therefore ignoble. And Sidney says maybe because of his infected will, he cannot be perfect, but he can appreciate with his wit perfection in nature. So here he is opposing the force of Calvinism, or he is suspecting that Calvinists would raise some objections to his argument. But these arguments will by few be understood and by few are granted. So Sidney immediately wants to leave these arguments because these are theological arguments. How far man's will is infected. It was a great subject of debate in the Renaissance, whether man's will is free or not. The question of free will. And the reformer Luther suggested that man has no free will. On the other hand, Erasmus opposed him and suggested that man has some freedom in his will. So there was a great debate between Luther and Erasmus. Sidney was of course aware of all these debates, but here he is trying to avoid any debate with the clergy, because the clergymen, the religious men, they were very orthodox, and it would not be wise to either make them angry or to have a debate with them. So he says that people will not understand these theological arguments, so let us not go into it any further. Thus much I hope will be given me that the Greeks, with some probability of reason, gave him the name above all names of learning. So, what name did the Greeks give man? Give the poet? That he is a maker. So Sidney says that that is the highest, possible name that one could give man. One could give a poet. That he is a maker, like God. And then he comes to the subject matter at hand, that is poetry. And in this treatise, he gives 2 definitions of poetry. So here we have the first definition. And if we think of this text, An Apology for Poetry, as an oration, 5-part oration, then this is the second part, that is proposition. So far from the beginning, the narration part was over, and now it is over, and now Sidney comes to the proposition of the oration, which is the first definition of poetry. So the 5-part structure of an oration was a concept of Cicero, the Roman rhetorician. So the first definition, poetry therefore is an art of imitation for so Aristotle termed it in his word mimesis. That is to say, representing, counterfeiting or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. So Sidney is using both Aristotle and Horace in this definition, as we can see. Aristotle in his mimesis, in his use of the word mimesis, suggested that poetry is an art of imitation. In his poetics, in Aristotle's poetics. So the Greek word mimesis means imitation. So what does poetry imitate? Nature. Representing, counterfeiting or figuring forth of nature. So mimesis or imitation means representation, counterfeiting, that is copying, figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture. So to conceive of poetry as a speaking picture, that is, one might say, mannerist concept, that poetry is a speaking picture. And what are its ends? To teach and delight. So typically, the Horatian idea that poetry is both utile et dulce, means useful and sweet. So Horace's idea of poetry is both didactic, insofar as poetry teaches, it is didactic, and insofar as it delights, it is an art that entertains. Then he goes on to speak about three kinds of poetry. What are the three kinds? Religious poetry, philosophical poetry, and strictly speaking poetry. That is poetry which is nothing else but poetry, not with any ulterior religious or philosophical motive. But you can see that Sidney is serious about this classification, because at that time religious poetry was considered important, particularly because of the Reformation. People attached a lot of importance to religion. And religious poetry for a Christian would be found mostly in the Bible. So such were David in his Psalms. Psalms, supposed to be written by David, is or has traditionally been considered as high poetry or very good poetry. And Sidney was extremely interested in the Psalms. We know that he translated the Psalms, and after his death, his sister Mary finished translation. So David's Psalms, Solomon's Song of Songs. Song of Songs in the Bible, apparently it is about erotic love, but it is actually a parable of divine. So man is suggested or represented as a lover of God, Christ. In Christianity, Christians imagine themselves to be the bride of Christ. All Christians imagine themselves to be the bride of Christ. So a love relationship between man and God, that is the idea behind this poem. Then Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, these books of the Bible, they are also known as poetry. Moses and Deborah in their hymns, and the writer of Job. The book of Job is also considered great poem, and it is often in the syllabus of English MA also. Which beside other, the learned Emmanuel Clemelius and Franciscus Junius do entitle the poetical part of the scripture. So you see, Sidney is very up to date in scholarship. So he is referring to two scholars, Emilius and Junius, according to whom these books are religious poetry and a part of the Bible. Against these none will speak that have the Holy Ghost in due holy reverence. So these are great authorities. So Sidney is quoting great authorities or citing them to prove his point. So these were Christian religious poetry, and then he talks about Greek religious poetry. In this kind, though in a full wrong divinity. Now this he must say, because in the Renaissance it was very important to point out that pagan literature or pagan art, however wonderful they may be, the pagans or the Greeks, they had wrong divinity. That is, they were not Christians, they were pagans, therefore their religion was wrong, so they will be damned. However beautiful art they may have created, they will be damned. So all Christians would praise the Greeks with this notification. So Sidney also does that in order to remain politically correct to his contemporary popes and bishops. So he says that even though in his full wrong divinity, but Orpheus Amphion, Homer in his hymns, and many other, both Greeks and Romans. So in Greek mythology, Orpheus and Amphion, they were known as famous poets and musicians. And Homer's hymns were great poetry, and similarly others were also there. And this poetry must be used by whosoever will follow St. James's counsel in singing psalms when they are many. And I will know is used with the fruit of comfort by some, when in sorrowful pangs of their death-feeling sins, they find the consolation of the never-leaving impotence. So the religious poetry, Sidney says, provides consolation to souls of sinners. The second classification of poetry is philosophical poetry. And he gives the examples of moral poetry like Tertius, Phocylides and Cato. Natural poetry, Lucretius, De Natura Rerum, the famous book by Lucretius, which had a great influence on the Renaissance. Of the nature of things, De Natura Rerum means of the nature of things by Lucretius. Then Virgil's Logics, or astronomical as Manilius and Pontanus. These were famous writers of astronomy. Or historical as Lucan, a writer, a Roman writer, to whom is like the fault is in their judgment, quite out of taste, and not is a sweet food or sweetly uttered knowledge. So those who do not like these great philosophical poets, they have a faulty taste or judgment, and the defect is not in the books, but in their taste. Then he comes to the actual poetry, which does not have any other subject like philosophy, history, or astronomy. Because this second sort is wrapped in the fold of the proposed subject and takes on the three course of its own invention, whether they properly be poets or not, let grammarian dispute. So Sidney has already said that poetry ranges freely in the zodiac of the poet's imagination. All other subjects, all other disciplines are tied to the subject. These poems, they are also tied to particular disciplines like astronomy, history, or philosophy. So whether whether they can be strictly called poets or not. That is something debatable. So Sidney says that I am not going into that debate. Let grammarians dispute. Now grammar in Sidney's time did not mean what we understand by grammar today. Grammar at that time meant the art of writing and criticism, not the grammar of language. And go to the third, indeed right poets of whom chiefly this question arises. So our exact topic of discussion are the poets, the true poets. Betwixt whom and these second is such a kind of difference as between the meaner sort of painters who counterfeit only such faces as are set before them, and the more excellent who have in no law but wit, bestow that in colours upon which is fittest for the eye to see. So the difference between poets who write on astronomy, philosophy, history and so on, and the genuine poets is that is like the difference between painters who can paint only those things that they can see before their eyes, as opposed to those painters who can paint things out of imagination. Counterfeited here means copies. So those who copy from nature and those who can draw freely. As the constant though lamenting look of Lucretia when she punished in herself another's fault, wherein he painted not Lucretia, whom he never saw, but painted the outward beauty of such a virtue. So the rape of Lucretia was a common theme in the Renaissance, used by many painters and poets. Even Shakespeare wrote The Rape of Lucrece, a poem on this topic. So whether the poet can genuinely create Lucretia's character, whether the poet imitates Lucretia historically or builds a character in his imagination, that is the issue. For this third day, which most properly do imitate to teach and delight, that is, those who are true poets, who depend only on imagination, they actually truly teach and delight. And to imitate borrow nothing of what is, has been or shall be. So they do not imitate what they find in nature, whether in the past, present or in future, but range with learned discretion into the divine consideration of what may be and what should be. So the true poets, they draw something or they represent things which are ideal, that which is ideal, that which should be, but that which is not there in this world, because in this world we never have the ideal or the perfect thing. So ordinary poets can imitate only those things which are in this world, but true poets can paint things which are ideal, which should be or ought to be, but yet not there. These be that, as the first and most noble sort may justly be termed of artists. So these are awaited on in the excellentest languages and best understandings in the foreprescribed name of poets. Therefore, such poets can truly be called artists or prophet, because they imagine things which should be, and they are the most excellent language they use and best understanding. So both in language and in judgment, these poets surpass all other poets. For these indeed to merely make to imitate, and imitate both to delight and teach, and delight to move men to take that goodness in hand, which without delight they would fly as from a stranger. So here Sidney is imitating Aristotle in a didactic manner. Aristotle, however, was not didactic in the exact in this fashion. But Sidney says that imitation, the purpose of imitation is teaching. So the best poets make or create in order to imitate, and then they imitate in order to teach and delight. And they delight to move men. Now there was the Renaissance logician, Dutch logician Rudolf who suggested that the ultimate function of writing or literature is, of course, teaching and guiding, but also moving. So the idea of moving, that is moving the emotions, Nicola says that. And Sidney here is including this idea of moving in his definition of poetry. To teach delight, to move men to take that goodness in hand, which without delight they would fly as from a stranger. So anything good, people do not easily accept that unless it is also pleasing. Therefore, without delight people fly from it or try to escape. And teach to make them know that goodness whereunto they are moved. So teaching means you make somebody know something. So these writers, they make people know what is the goodness in it. And teach to make them know that goodness, which being the noblest scope to which ever any learning was directed, yet want there not idle tongues to bark at them. So the noblest purpose of any learning is finally to move somebody who is taught and through delight, and then finally is moved, of course moved to do something moral, something good. So that is the highest purpose of learning. But nevertheless, there are still people who do not stop from barking at them, that is criticizing the poets. So we will stop here.